On the morning of May 2, 1945, a German general named Helmuth Weidling walked out of his command post in the ruins of central Berlin and surrendered the city to Soviet General Vasily Chukov. Tucked in his pocket was a signed order telling whatever remained of Berlin's garrison to stop fighting. 400 meters away in the Chancellery Garden lay the burned and partially destroyed corpses of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, and down in the cellars, subway tunnels, and shattered basements of the city, approximately 134,000 German soldiers waited to be taken prisoner. The war in Europe would last 6 more days. For Berlin, it was already done. What follows is the story of the 17 days that led to Weidling's walk, not the tidy, inevitable collapse that most accounts describe, where the numbers made the outcome certain and the only real drama was timing. The actual story is more contested, more costly, and more human than that. A battle fought over a question that had already been answered. A political structure rotting from within while soldiers and children died street by street for rubble that would change hands regardless. A command structure so fractured that some of the last men defending the Führer's bunker were not German at all. And beneath all of it, decisions on both sides that cost far more lives than they needed to, driven not by military logic, but by ambition, rivalry, ideology, and fear. To understand what happened between April 16 and May 2, 1945, start with what the strategic map looked like the week before the offensive opened. Germany had been losing the war in every measurable dimension for nearly 2 years. Crossing the Rhine in late March, the Western Allies had encircled Army Group B in the Ruhr and pushed freely into central Germany. The Red Army had reached the Oder River, roughly 60 kilometers east of Berlin, and paused to regroup after the grinding logistical strain of the Vistula-Oder offensive earlier that winter. April had already taken 2 major German cities. Königsberg, the historic Prussian capital, fell to the Soviet Third Belarusian Front on April 9, and Vienna went to the Second and Third Ukrainian fronts 4 days after that. Roosevelt died on April 12 inside the Führer bunker. Something close to hope briefly surfaced. Hitler and Goebbels reached back to the 7 Years' War and the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, the moment when Prussia, on the verge of destruction, had been saved by the sudden death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth, whose successor admired Frederick the Great and immediately switched sides. The ideological gap between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union, they believed, might now tear the Allied coalition apart the same way. Truman assumed the presidency. The coalition held. The miracle did not come. Since January 16, 1945, Hitler had been living underground in the Führer bunker, a reinforced concrete structure approximately 8.5 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. Around him, a dwindling circle of generals, aides, secretaries, and true believers kept up the fiction of a functioning command structure. Above him, roughly 4 million Berliners waited in a city already reduced in large stretches to rubble by Allied bombing. 3 Soviet military formations faced Berlin from the east, each the size of a full army group. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front sat due west of the city along the Oder and the Silo Heights. Marshal Ivan Konyev's 1st Ukrainian front massed to the south along the Nysa River. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian front pressed from the north, its job to pin the German 3rd Panzer Army and cut off any relief attempt from that direction. The combined 3-front total, 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns, 7,500 aircraft, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars, 3,255 Katyusha rocket launchers, and 95,383 motor vehicles. Attached to Zhukov's front alone, 78,556 Polish troops of the Polish First Army. Blocking Zhukov's road to Berlin was the Silo Heights, defended by approximately 100,000 to 112,000 men of General Theodore Bussy's 9th Army, supported by roughly 1,200 guns and tanks. Those numbers tell part of the story. What they conceal is that Bussy's force was far from uniform. The 9th Army carried veteran divisions that had fought continuously since 1941, and their surviving soldiers were, almost by definition, experienced, resourceful, and grimly capable men the battlefield had selected over 4 years of continuous killing. The ridge at Silo favored exactly that kind of fighter, high ground fortified over weeks, with prepared positions, pre-registered artillery, and clear observation down over the flat Oder floodplain below. The man commanding Army Group Vistula above Bussy was General Gotthard Heinrichsei, who had taken over on March 20 from Heinrich Himmler, whose appointment in January had been a political gesture with zero military logic, since Himmler had never commanded at Army Group level and spent his time in the role chasing self-advancement. Heinrichsei was the opposite in every way: quiet, technically exacting, famous as a defensive specialist, and entirely unimpressed by the political pressures emanating from Berlin. Among German commanders in the war's final phase, Heinrichsei would prove among the most consequential, not for winning anything, but for the quality of the rear guard he ran. The ratio between Soviet and German forces is where the conventional story settles into inevitability. What actually followed was considerably more expensive than that framing suggests. April 16, 1945. Approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, on the west bank of the Oder River. Zhukov's opening plan included something no Soviet operation had tried before: 143 anti-aircraft searchlights, physically transported from the air defense batteries ringing Moscow, lined up along the riverbank and aimed at the German positions on the heights. Blind the defenders, illuminate the attacker's path, let the wall of light collapse German resistance before a single infantryman reached the ridge. The bombardment came first, approximately 8,983 artillery pieces opening up along Zhukov's front in the opening hours. Soldiers on both sides described the sound not as thunder but as a change in atmospheric state, a sustained physical pressure that lasted for hours. Then the searchlights fired. And that is when it went wrong. The pre-dawn barrage had already churned the Oder floodplain, partly flooded, laced with drainage ditches and anti-tank obstacles, into a landscape of craters, smoke, and particulate clouds so thick that when the searchlight beams hit it, they reflected straight back, silhouetting the advancing Soviet infantry instead of blinding the Germans looking down from the ridge above. The second problem ran deeper, and Zhukov's intelligence had missed it entirely. Heinrichsei had read the Soviet supply movements correctly and deduced the attack was coming on the night of April 15 to 16. His response was operationally elegant and tactically ruthless. He ordered his frontline troops to vacate their forward trenches the night before. When the greatest opening barrage in Eastern Front history fell on the German defensive line, it fell on empty dirt. There is a concept in modern cybersecurity called honeypot deception, the deliberate creation of an inviting fake target to absorb an attacker's best effort while the real system sits untouched behind it. Heinrichsei's withdrawal was the 1945 ground war equivalent. Zhukov's artillery burned through enormous quantities of shells against a position that had already been abandoned. The real fight waited on the ridge above. 4 days of brutal terrain combat followed. The Silo Heights are not dramatic geography. The ridge rises only 30 to 50 meters above the floodplain, with the small town of Silo at the top. But in April 1945, those meters were fortified with interlocking positions, anti-tank ditches, and minefields, and Bussy's Ninth Army fought on ground it had chosen and prepared. Under intense pressure from Moscow, and increasingly aware that Stalin had authorized Konev's front to race northward if the breakthrough did not materialize, Zhukov committed his 2 tank armies, the 1st Guards and the 2nd Guards, prematurely, in daylight, before the infantry had cleared the ridge. Tanks without infantry support funneled into narrow approaches through the flooded meadows, competing for road space with supply columns and artillery, everything moving and nothing advancing, and all of it under fire. Soldiers from the leading divisions later described the approach roads as a traffic jam during an air raid. By April 17, Stalin had seen enough. He called both commanders and redirected 2 of Konev's tank armies northward, into Zhukov's nominal sector, toward Berlin from the south. The race to Berlin, the rivalry that would shape every decision in the weeks ahead, started its clock not from Soviet success but from Zhukov's public failure at the heights. April 19, the Silo line finally broke. The cost, German dead at Silo ran to approximately 12,000. Soviet dead ran far higher. Zhukov himself reportedly admitted to more than 33,000 killed at the heights, and at least 727 Soviet tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed in the assault. The road to Berlin opened. The force that opened it had paid an enormous and, in the judgment of many historians, avoidable price for an approach that alternative planning could have bypassed. While Zhukov's armies ground through the mud at Silo, something was taking shape inside Berlin that the conventional narrative tends to compress into a few sentences about last-ditch defenders. On paper, the Berlin defense area had a layered structure, 8 outer sectors, designated A through H, surrounding a central zone called the Citadel. Inside the Citadel sat the Reichstag, the Reich Chancellery, the Brandenburg Gate, and beneath the Chancellery Garden, the Führerbunker. Operation Clausewitz, the formal defense plan established on March 9, envisioned a coherent, layered resistance. What actually occupied those sectors told a different story. Regular Wehrmacht troops were there, but these were remnants of broken formations, men pulled from the collapsing Eastern Front with no time to regroup, re-equip, or even establish who commanded whom. Divisions existed on paper with effective strengths of a few hundred men. Waffen-SS units filled some gaps, among them the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, which by April 1945 included Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, Latvians, Estonians, and Dutch volunteers, men fighting in German uniforms for a regime that had occupied, exploited, or collaborated with most of their home countries. Luftwaffe flak crews stripped from their anti-aircraft batteries showed up with infantry weapons they had never trained on and no doctrine for using. Berlin police, railway workers, and factory employees joined the mix on the logic that a warm body with a weapon was a soldier. And then there was the Volkssturm. Hitler's decree of September 25, 1944, publicly inaugurated by Himmler on October 18, enrolled every male German citizen aged 16 to 60 not already in uniform. Veterans of the First World War in their late 50s and 60s, many already carrying the physical damage of that earlier conflict. Boys of 15, 14, some as young as 12, handed weapons and assigned positions. They arrived at assembly points in civilian clothes with armbands, carrying a chaotic mix of German carbines, Czech rifles, Italian pistols, captured Soviet anti-tank rifles, and large quantities of Panzerfaust single-shot rocket launchers, a weapon needing almost no training to fire, capable of destroying a tank at up to 100 meters, and frequently mismatched to the available ammunition. Wehrmacht veterans called them Eintopf, casserole, everything thrown in together. And the darker joke running through officers' messes was that Volkssturm soldiers had silver in their hair, gold in their mouth, and lead in their limbs. Roughly 60,000 were organized into approximately 92 battalions across the Berlin area, the better armed formations sent forward, the unarmed held in reserve to inherit weapons from men who died. Artur Axmann, the Reich youth leader, sent an estimated 3,500 to 6,000 Hitler youth fighters into Berlin's defense. Boys decorated personally by Hitler in the Chancellery Garden on April 20, his 56th birthday, were assigned to the Pichelsdorf bridges over the Havel River, the crossing point for General Walther Wenck's 12th Army relief attempt and the last viable escape route westward. Alfred Scheck, 12 years old, became the youngest documented Iron Cross recipient of the entire war, decorated in that garden on April 20. The broad strategic picture, Soviet millions against German thousands, mathematical certainty of outcome, cannot fully capture what Berlin's defense sectors actually contained in those final days. A city of 4 million civilians defended, in its final hours, by men who had survived a war that ended before many of their own fathers were born, and by children who could not legally drive, vote, or purchase alcohol in peacetime. Between those two extremes, police officers, factory workers, tram drivers, and railway engineers all handed weapons and pointed at a line. Helmuth Weidling, appointed to command the Berlin defense area on April 23 or 24, replacing a succession of hapless predecessors, looked at what he had inherited and reached a conclusion that was militarily obvious within hours: the city could not be held. A competent Panzer Corps commander who had been briefly sentenced to death by Hitler for an unauthorized withdrawal, the sentence reversed when Hitler decided Weidling was more useful alive. He spent the next 8 days managing a surrender that his commander-in-chief had already forbidden by direct order. April 20, 1945 was Hitler's 56th birthday. In peacetime the date had been a mandatory national holiday, youth rallies, mass parades, choreographed adoration built over more than 2 decades of deliberate cultivation. On April 20, 1945, Soviet artillery was firing on Berlin's eastern suburbs for the first time, American bombers had struck the city that morning, and the outer defensive ring to the east was beginning to crack. Hitler emerged from the bunker into the Chancellery Garden for the last time in his life. The photographs and film from that morning show a figure barely recognizable as the man who had launched the war 6 years earlier. His left hand trembled visibly and without apparent control, so pronounced that in the film record he is sometimes seen gripping his left wrist with his right hand to suppress it. The posture was deeply stooped, the face gray and deeply lined, aged far beyond 56 years, and the movement was a shuffle that contrasted with the brisk, commanding stride of his earlier public life. Medical historians have traced symptoms consistent with Parkinson's disease back to 1941 in Hitler's behavior and physical presentation, with progressive worsening visible in film and photographs from 1943 onward. By April 1945, the tremor in the left hand had stopped being intermittent, it was constant, and Hitler had developed compensatory habits to hide it from visitors, gripping one hand with the other, avoiding postures that made it worse. Senior Nazi officials gathered briefly to pay their respects, Göring, Himmler, Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop, and Armaments Minister Albert Speer among others, each of them, by their own later accounts, recognizing this as a final gathering of people who would shortly be dead, imprisoned, or running. Brief words exchanged with a physically diminished man surrounded by the sound of Soviet artillery, and then they left Berlin for the last time. Speer carried a particular secret. Managing Germany's armaments production for 3 years, the minister had systematically disobeyed Hitler's Nero decree, the March 1945 order to destroy all of Germany's industrial and infrastructure assets rather than let them fall to the Allies. Speer had countermanded the order wherever he could reach, believing Germany's population would need those assets to survive the post-war period. He came to say goodbye knowing he had defied Hitler in what was arguably the most consequential act of disobedience in the war's final months. There was a second dimension to Hitler's physical deterioration that most treatments of this period understate, the pharmacological one. Dr. Theodor Morell, his personal physician, had maintained Hitler for years on a regimen that modern clinical assessment would classify as dangerous polypharmacy. Pervitin, an amphetamine marketed for alertness and mood elevation, Eucadil, the Merck trade name for oxycodone, cocaine eye drops used for a condition affecting his left eye, testosterone injections, glucose, and various tonic preparations of uncertain composition. The Merck plant producing Eucadil had been destroyed in Allied bombing by late 1944, disrupting the supply. Morell departed the bunker around April 21 to 23. Accounts differ slightly, leaving Hitler without his primary pharmaceutical management in the war's final days. Whether the drugs had been masking the Parkinson's progression, or whether their removal accelerated the psychological deterioration visible in that final fortnight, remains contested among medical historians. What is not contested is what happened at the April 22 Situation Conference, with Zhukov's armies already pushing through the outer defense ring from the east. Hitler had, by April 21, ordered the creation of Army Detachment Steiner, a formation named after Sobergruppenführer Felix Steiner, an experienced Waffen-SS Corps commander. On paper, Steiner's force was tasked with a decisive counteroffensive from north of Berlin, striking across the advancing Soviet left flank to cut the encirclement before it could close. In reality, Army Detachment Steiner barely qualified as a formation. Understrength infantry units, Luftwaffe ground crew with no infantry training, a contingent of dock workers, and a small number of captured French tanks in uncertain mechanical condition. Steiner surveyed what he had and delivered his verdict to his superiors: "I won't do it. This attack is nonsense, murder. Do what you want to me." The attack never happened. When Hitler was told at the April 22 conference that Steiner had not moved, that the counteroffensive existed only in Führer orders, not in operational reality, the room underwent a transformation that multiple eyewitnesses, and those immediately told by eyewitnesses, described as unlike anything the bunker had produced. A long silence, and then an eruption. Hitler declared the war lost. He announced that he had been betrayed by the generals, by the SS, by the German people themselves, whose suffering he attributed to their failure to be worthy of his leadership rather than to the consequences of a war he had started. In front of multiple witnesses including senior military officers, he stated his intention to remain in Berlin and shoot himself. No Alpine redoubt. No flight north to the Naval Command. The bunker, and death in it. When the storm broke, Generals Jodl and Keitel offered an alternative with enough surface credibility to give Hitler something to hold: redirect Walther Wenck's 12th Army, then deployed against the Americans on the Elbe in western Germany, and turn it eastward toward Berlin. Operationally doubtful from the first moment, the Wenck rescue fantasy gave the bunker something it needed. Hitler approved the order. April 23 through April 25, 1945 were the days when the military outcome of the entire Eastern Front became visible as geometry. From the north and east, Zhukov's armies closed toward Berlin's outer ring. From the south, Konev's tank armies, partly operating in Zhukov's designated sector now, redirected by Stalin, swung upward through the suburban districts. Wenck's 12th Army, formally turned around by Keitel's order on April 23, began its relief attempt from the west. At 12:56 in the morning on April 23, a telegram arrived at the Führer bunker. Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal, head of the Luftwaffe, and Hitler's officially designated successor, sent it from his estate in Bavaria. Göring invoked the 1941 decree naming him Hitler's successor in the event of Hitler's incapacity, and asked, since Hitler had declared his intention to die in Berlin, whether Göring should now assume executive leadership of the Reich. A deadline was attached: if he received no reply by 10 o'clock that evening, he would take silence as confirmation. Martin Bormann moved the moment he saw it. Hitler's personal secretary, who had spent years systematically dismantling the influence of potential rivals, framed the telegram to Hitler not as an awkward succession question but as a coup attempt. A betrayal. Hitler stripped Göring of all offices. The SS placed him under arrest at Moderndorf Castle in Bavaria. The man who had commanded the Luftwaffe since 1935 and run the four-year plan economic apparatus spent Germany's final week in SS custody. 2 days later, on April 25, two events simultaneously sealed the war's geometry. At Torgau on the Elbe River, 180 kilometers southwest of Berlin, patrols from the American 69th Infantry Division encountered soldiers from the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division. Germany had been physically cut in two, and any prospect of coordinating the Wehrmacht's northern and southern remnants died with that meeting. On that same April 25, the Soviet encirclement of Berlin closed completely. The 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts linked up west of the city. The ring was sealed, and 4 million civilians together with an improvised garrison were now cut off from any possibility of organized supply or reinforcement. That encirclement is, operationally, almost a textbook illustration of what modern supply chain theory calls network isolation, deliberately severing all logistical inflow to a system until it collapses under its own resource depletion. Amazon's fulfillment network is specifically engineered to resist exactly this failure mode. Every major distribution hub connects to at least 3 independent supply routes, so no single severing event can cut off delivery to a region. Berlin in April 1945 had nothing like that redundancy. When the ring closed, the city had days of ammunition and food. Southeast of Berlin near Halbe, the rearguard of the German 9th Army attempted to break westward through the closing Soviet lines, and most of it died in the attempt. Inside the sealed perimeter, the 3 massive concrete flak towers dotting Berlin became the last fixed defensive points with any genuine capability to resist Soviet armor. The Zoo Tower, Flakturmei, in the Tiergarten near the Berlin Zoo, was a reinforced concrete structure with walls up to 8 meters thick, housing twin 12.8 centimeters guns that could engage Soviet ground forces as effectively as aircraft. Soviet gunners brought 203 mm howitzers, among the heaviest pieces in the Red Army's arsenal, to bear on it. The shells did not penetrate. More than 15,000 Berliners had taken shelter inside the tower, numbers reportedly swelling toward 30,000 at the battle's peak, alongside an 85-bed hospital and priceless collections from Berlin's state museums, Egyptian antiquities, gold artifacts, paintings and sculptures placed there on the calculation that 8 meters of reinforced concrete would protect what Allied bombing had not. The calculation held. While the flak towers held, the most ideologically incongruous defenders in the entire battle were dying in the streets of Neukölln and the government district. The 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, named Charlemagne after the 9th-century Frankish emperor, had spent the war as one of Germany's strangest formations, French volunteers fighting in German uniforms for a regime that had occupied France since 1940. The Charlemagne division's existence traced the specific logic of European fascist collaboration, anti-communism, ideological conviction, and the political trajectory that led some French veterans of the Spanish Civil War to conclude the Soviet Union posed the greater threat to Western civilization. By April 1945, the division's effective strength had collapsed from over 7,000 to roughly 320 or 330 men who arrived in Berlin on April 24, answering General Keitel's summons. Among the final defenders of the government district and the Chancellery compound, the Charlemagne Sturm Battalion was credited in German after-action reports with destroying approximately 62 of the 108 Soviet tanks claimed knocked out in the southeastern sector by April 28. Eugene Vollet, a Frenchman, received one of the last Knight's Crosses of the entire war on April 29 and was killed within days of receiving it. By Berlin's surrender, the Charlemagne formation had somewhere between 30 and 60 men still standing. The question rarely asked in standard accounts is why Frenchmen were dying at a German dictator's bunker. The answer involves the specific fractures of French politics during the occupation, anti-communist ideology, and individual biographies shaped by war and collaboration, but the bare fact remains one of the most historically striking details of the entire battle. Among the Führerbunker's last defenders, a large proportion were not German. April 28, 1945. Three events that day, taken together, form as concentrated a portrait of the Third Reich's collapse as anything across the regime's entire 12-year run. The first, confirmation reached Hitler that Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, head of the entire SS apparatus and the Gestapo, the man who above all others had organized and executed the Holocaust, had been secretly negotiating a surrender with Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, using the neutral diplomat as an intermediary. Himmler had met Bernadotte on April 23 in the Swedish consulate in Lübeck and offered to surrender all German forces on the Western Front to the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviet Union in the East. Transmitted to Churchill and Truman, the offer was rejected. The BBC broadcast the story before the Führerbunker received it through official channels. Hitler's response was cold and systematic. Himmler was ordered arrested. SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's liaison officer in the bunker, and also the husband of Eva Braun's sister Gretel, was taken into custody and shot by firing squad in the Chancellery garden. Fegelein had already been caught attempting to slip out of Berlin in civilian clothes with forged papers and a packed suitcase containing cash and jewelry. The combination of that earlier desertion attempt and his connection to Himmler's negotiations sealed his fate on April 28. The second, Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had pioneered the fascist model that Hitler had studied, adapted, and in many respects exceeded, was captured by Italian communist partisans near Giuliano di Mezzegra on Lake Como and shot. Mussolini's body and that of his mistress Clara Petacci were driven to Milan and hung upside down from a petrol station roof on the Piazzale Loreto, the same square where 15 partisan hostages had been publicly executed on Mussolini's orders the previous year. Photographs of the Piazzale Loreto arrived in the bunker, and Hitler commented on them. He stated explicitly that he would not allow himself or Eva Braun to be displayed or desecrated that way, and he gave instructions, subsequently carried out, that both bodies were to be burned completely after death. The Third, Wing's 12th Army sent word back to Berlin that it could not break through. The army had turned east, fought its way into the Potsdam area, absorbed serious casualties from Soviet forces that outnumbered and outgunned it, and reached the limits of what was operationally possible. Rather than order his men into a suicidal frontal assault on a Soviet encirclement ring far too thick and too deep to crack, Wing chose to use whatever westward corridor remained open to rescue civilians and soldiers trying to reach Allied captivity rather than Soviet captivity. Tens of thousands crossed the Elbe on that corridor. Berlin was not among them. The last rescue fantasy was finished. What came next, after midnight, technically already April 29, was one of the most peculiarly human moments in the entire collapse. Adolf Hitler got married. Eva Braun had flown to the encircled city in mid-April against Hitler's explicit instructions that she stay in Munich, knowing she was almost certainly flying toward her death, because she refused to be separated from the man she had been privately attached to for more than 12 years. A municipal official named Walter Wagner was located and escorted through the bombardment specifically to conduct the ceremony in the bunker's small conference room. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann served as witnesses, and before the vows could be exchanged, Walter Wagner was legally obligated to verify that both parties were of Aryan descent and free of hereditary diseases as required by the racial legislation Hitler himself had signed into law. After the wedding breakfast, champagne, sandwiches, reminiscences, Hitler retired with his secretary Traudl Junge and dictated his political and personal testaments. The political testament expelled Göring and Himmler from the party and all their offices for disloyalty and betrayal, named Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as the new Reich President and Supreme Commander, named Goebbels as Reich Chancellor, appointed a new cabinet, attributed the war to the international statesmen who were either of Jewish origin or worked for Jewish interests, and ordered the German people and the new government to continue the racial struggle. All of this was signed at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on April 29 by Hitler, Goebbels, Bormann, and 2 military witnesses. Junge later recalled that transcribing the testament produced an emotion she had not expected, not horror at its darkness, but revulsion at its ordinariness. The final document of the Third Reich carried none of the weight she might have anticipated. Self-justification. Score settling. The familiar pattern of a man who had never once accepted responsibility for anything. Eva Braun gave Junge her fur coat that same morning. "Take it as a memory," Braun said. "I always like well-dressed women." Here is the argument that most documentaries about the fall of Berlin either avoid or bury in a footnote, and that the historical evidence supports with considerable force. The Soviet casualty toll at Berlin was not the unavoidable cost of defeating the last fanatical German resistance. A large portion of it was unnecessary, inflated by rivalry between Soviet commanders, by Stalin's political imperatives, and by operational decisions that systematically prioritized speed, prestige, and personal advancement over tactical efficiency and the lives of Soviet soldiers. The standard narrative frames Soviet casualties as the tragic but predictable price of urban warfare against a desperate enemy. The evidence-grounded alternative is that tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers died in April 1945 for a city that was going to fall anyway faster than it did, against a defense that was already rotting from within, and that the manner in which they died was shaped less by military necessity than by the specific competition Stalin had engineered between his 2 best commanders. Start with what the numbers actually say. Grigory Krivashev's analysis of declassified Soviet archival records, the standard reference for these figures, put Soviet dead or missing across the entire Berlin strategic offensive operation at 81,116, with 280,251 wounded or sick, totaling approximately 361,000 casualties and at least 1,997 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed. Anthony Beaver, drawing on the same archives with slightly different methodology for his 2002 study, arrives at 78,291 killed and 274,184 wounded. Max Hastings places the killed figure above 100,000. John Erickson, in the most encompassing assessment, wrote that the battle for Berlin cost 500,000 human beings their lives, their well-being, or their sanity when all 3 fronts losses across the full operation are counted. At Seelow Heights alone, 4 days, 1 ridge, Soviet dead ran above 33,000, with at least 727 armored vehicles destroyed. German military dead at the same engagement, approximately 12,000. A 3-to-1 Soviet to German killed ratio, at a position where the Soviets held numerical superiority of roughly 20-to-1 in men and comparable advantages in armor and artillery. That ratio demands explanation. Terrain and desperate defense were real factors. But neither is sufficient on its own. Stalin had engineered the Zhukov-Konev competition with deliberate precision. The boundary line between their operational sectors stopped just short of Berlin, leaving the question of which front would take the city formally open, and he told both men explicitly that the prize belonged to whoever arrived first. When Zhukov stalled at Seelow, Stalin activated the pressure by redirecting Konev's tank armies northward, rewarding Konev and punishing Zhukov simultaneously while accelerating the operational pace. The consequences played out at every level of the urban battle that followed. Beaver documents accounts of Soviet units from the two fronts firing on each other in the confusion of converging approaches to the city center. Chukhov's 8th Guards Army reportedly maneuvered specifically to cut off Konev's 3rd Guards Tank Army from the Reichstag, blocking their path. Those friendly fire incidents were not accidents of war, they were the structural consequence of a command arrangement that turned two armies into competitors for the same symbolic objective. Soviet commanders at every level committed forces at a pace that prioritized reaching specific buildings before adjacent units from the same front, or before units from the rival front. The willingness to absorb enormous losses to plant a flag on the Reichstag, or reach the Chancellery, or cross the Brandenburg Gate first, reflected a command culture in which Stalin's approval and personal prestige outweighed every other consideration. The logic cascaded downward and the casualties cascaded upward. On the other side of the equation sat Eisenhower's decision to halt at the Elbe. In a cable to General Marshall on March 30, 1945, Eisenhower had written flatly that Berlin itself is no longer a particularly important objective. General Omar Bradley estimated taking Berlin might cost 100,000 American casualties and called it a pretty stiff price to pay for a prestige objective, especially when we'll have to fall back and let the other fellow take over. Eisenhower gave 3 reasons for halting. American forces were already beyond the agreed post-war occupation zones and would have to withdraw. He feared accidental combat with the advancing Red Army, and he regarded Berlin as a political rather than a military objective. American forces stopped at the Elbe on April 12. Churchill and Montgomery disagreed, publicly and forcefully. The political argument, that reaching Berlin first would have given the Western Allies decisive power in the post-war European settlement, carries real weight. So does the military argument that the cost in Allied lives would have been comparable to or greater than the Soviet cost. Both positions are defensible. What is documented is the outcome. The Western Allies halted, the Soviets took Berlin at enormous cost, and the post-war European order was shaped in part by that sequence. From the perspective of 81,000 plus Soviet soldiers who died in the operation, Stalin's calculation that the casualties were an acceptable price for political dominance of post-war Europe looks somewhat different. April 30, 1945. Germany's parliament building, the Reichstag, largely unused as a legislature since the arson fire of February 1933 and the seizure of power that followed, damaged by Allied bombing in the years since, and now converted into a makeshift fortress packed with SS troops and Volkssturm, was the symbolic target Stalin had designated for the Berlin offensive. A Soviet flag on the Reichstag roof was the image the leadership wanted from this battle. The building's military importance was secondary. Its symbolic weight was absolute. The assault fell to the 150th Rifle Division and other units of Colonel General Vasily Kuznetsov's 3rd Shock Army. Open ground had to be crossed under fire before Soviet infantry even reached the walls, and inside, SS troops and miscellaneous defenders had turned every room into a defensive position, machine gun nests in doorways, snipers on the staircases, grenades through every opening, and the specific horror of close-quarters combat in smoke-filled corridors where identifying friend from enemy took a fraction of a second and the consequence of error was immediate and final. Soviet soldiers fought through the ground floor, then the stairs, then each corridor of each floor, in fighting where the effective tactical unit was the individual and whatever he could reach with his hands or his weapon. Sometime in the evening of April 30th, the exact hour is genuinely disputed, and the dispute itself reveals something important about how the Soviet Union managed its own history. A Soviet flag appeared on or in the Reichstag building. The official account, promoted in war memorials and school curricula for decades, credited 2 men, Meliton Kantaria, a Georgian, and Mikhail Yegorov, a Russian. The attribution was calculated. Stalin, himself Georgian, wanted the iconic moment of the war's symbolic resolution to represent both the dominant Russian majority and his own national origin. Alexei Berest, a Ukrainian officer who actually commanded the flag raising and physically assisted in doing so, was written out of the official record entirely. Denied the hero of the Soviet Union designation his comrades received, Berest died in 1970, killed by a train while saving a child from the tracks. Ukraine recognized Berest posthumously as a hero of Ukraine in 2005. At least 3 other serious competing claims exist. A group led by Sergeant Vladimir Makov, including Mikhail Minin, who reportedly fixed a Soviet flag to a statue atop the Reichstag at approximately 22:40 on the night of April 30, has documentation supporting an earlier claim than Kantaria and Yegorov. A Kazakh soldier, Rakimzhan Kashkarbayev, and his comrade Grigory Bulatov, who placed a flag on the Reichstag facade earlier on April 30, are claimed by Kazakh historical sources as the true first raisers. Kashkarbayev spent years seeking official recognition and died without it. The most recognizable image of the flag raising, the photograph reproduced in hundreds of millions of copies, appearing in every Western documentary about the Second World War, among the most viewed photographs in the history of the medium, was taken by Soviet photographer Yevgeny Koldyaev on May 2, 1945. 2 days after the Reichstag was taken. A staged reenactment. The original version showed a second wristwatch on the wrist of a soldier in the lower frame, evidence of looting from German civilians. The watch was retouched out before publication, and the photograph was distributed globally as authentic documentary evidence of a spontaneous moment. Both things are true simultaneously. The photograph is one of the most reproduced images in 20th century history, and in its original form it is a staged image with a looting watch edited out of it. The manipulation of the Reichstag flag story was part of a broader pattern of historical management that shaped what the world knew about the fall of Berlin for decades. The same pattern extended to what happened in the bunker 400 meters away. Smersh, Soviet military counterintelligence, located and excavated the partially burned remains of Hitler and Eva Braun from the Chancellery Garden on May 3 to 5. Forensic identification came through dental evidence. Hitler's dental assistant Kathy Huserman and his dental technician Fritz Eckmann were located and interrogated by SMERSH and confirmed that the remains matched Hitler's known dental records and prosthetic work. An interpreter named Elena Rzevskaya was assigned to safeguard the key dental evidence, which she kept in a red velvet box. Despite that confirmed forensic identification, Stalin publicly stated in June 1945 that Hitler might still be alive, might have escaped to Spain or Argentina. The denial was not confusion. It was deliberate policy. Ambiguity about Hitler's death served Soviet political interests. It complicated Western demands for closure, preserved a propaganda instrument Moscow could deploy when useful, and let Stalin shape the narrative of the war's end on his own terms. Huserman and Eckmann, who had confirmed the identification, were subsequently imprisoned in the Soviet Union for years, in part, historians believe, to suppress the forensic testimony. Rzevskaya later published a memoir describing what it was like to carry the dental evidence in her red velvet box through the chaos of May 1945, knowing what it meant and knowing it would not be used. While Soviet soldiers were still fighting through the Reichstag floor by floor, less than 400 meters away in the Führer bunker, the war's most consequential suicide was underway. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon of April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the right temple in his private study in the lower bunker. Eva Braun, his wife of fewer than 40 hours, died at the same moment from cyanide poisoning, a capsule bitten down on. The circumstances of those deaths have been debated, contested, and deliberately obscured for decades, partly because the physical evidence passed into the control of a government with strong political reasons to complicate the forensic record, and partly because the manner of death of the war's central figure carries obvious historical weight that multiple interested parties have tried to shape. Primary eyewitness testimony came from Hitler's valet Heinz Ling and his adjutant Otto Gunsch, both of whom entered the private study immediately after. Their independent accounts, corroborated by others in the outer rooms, described a single gunshot heard through the closed door, the smell of gunpowder when the door opened, Hitler slumped on the sofa with a contact wound to the right temple and his Walther PPK on the floor, and Eva Braun dead beside him with no gunshot wound and cyanide evidence at her mouth. The Soviet forensic account, first published in 1968 by intelligence operative Lev Bezamensky in a book called The Death of Adolf Hitler, claimed on the basis of the Soviet autopsy that Hitler had died from cyanide, not a gunshot, and that the gunshot was a post-mortem disfigurement. Western historians, Joachim Fest, Anton Joachimsthaler, and Hugh Trevor Roper, whose 1947 investigation for British military intelligence produced the first full account of Hitler's death, rejected the Soviet version as politically motivated. They pointed to the eyewitness testimony, the ballistic evidence, and the inherent implausibility of the Soviet account. Bezimensky himself, in later years, acknowledged his book contained deliberate lies inserted at the direction of the Soviet state. What is not in dispute is what came next. Per Hitler's explicit instructions, given directly after the photographs of Mussolini's Piazzale Loreto arrived, the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun were carried upstairs to the Chancellery garden, placed in a shallow pit, doused in petrol brought up through constant Soviet artillery fire, and set alight. Staff attended briefly before returning below ground. The fire burned for hours and was not sufficient to fully destroy the remains. The garden was under bombardment, petrol supplies were limited, and a complete cremation under those conditions was not achievable. Smersh located and transported the remains to a Soviet field intelligence facility outside Berlin. The dental records match established beyond any reasonable doubt whose remains these were. Stalin chose to suppress the finding. A skull fragment held in the Russian State Archive in Moscow, presented for decades as possibly part of Hitler's skull, cited by Russian officials when dismissing Western forensic conclusions, was analyzed by American DNA researchers in 2018. The bone came from a woman under 40. The forensically verified remains of Adolf Hitler, including the dental evidence identified by Huserman and Ekman, passed through Soviet control in 1945, and their subsequent fate remains, even now, partly unresolved. May 1, 1945. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda for 12 years and the newly designated Chancellor of the Reich under Hitler's testament, had appended a personal statement explaining why he would not comply with its instruction to continue the government's work in the north under Donitz. Loyalty, oath, conscience, none of these permitted him to abandon his Führer in the hour of death. He would stay. He would die in Berlin. A political performance of the kind Goebbels had been crafting his entire adult life, and at the same moment, a decision to kill his children. All six had been brought into the Führer bunker by their parents in the final days. Helga Suzanne, born September 1, 1932, 12 years old. Hildegard, called Hilda, born April 13, 1934, 11. Helmut Christian, born October 2, 1935, 9. Holdine, called Hold, born February 19, 1937, 8. Hedwig, called Hedda, born May 5, 1938, 6. Heidrun, called Heidi, born October 29, 1940, 4 years old. Their names all began with H, a Goebbels family naming convention unrelated to Hitler that had generated speculation ever since. Their half-brother Harold Quandt, from Magda Goebbels' first marriage, was a prisoner of war somewhere in Allied captivity. Harold survived. Magda Goebbels had written to Harold in the bunker's final days. "The world that came after the Führer and National Socialism," she wrote, "was not worth living in." She had decided to take the children with her. She did not ask him to understand. She asked him to be loyal, to himself, to the German people, to his homeland, and told him the decision she was making was the only honorable one available. On the evening of May 1, SS dentist Helmut Kunz administered morphine injections to all 6 children, sedating them. Then, the exact sequence is slightly disputed among accounts. Magda Goebbels and Hitler's physician Ludwig Stumpfegger administered cyanide capsules to each child. Soviet forensic pathologists examining the remains found bruising on the eldest child, Helga, inconsistent with passive sedation. The bruising was consistent with resistance. She was 12 years old. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, had been in the bunker since the previous year and had witnessed the entire final collapse from within. She had transcribed the testament, been at the wedding breakfast, interacted daily with the Goebbels children, who were, by all accounts, cheerful and uncomprehending inside the bunker, playing cards, asking questions, unaware of what was coming. Learning of the children's deaths was, Junge later wrote, the moment when something inside her finally and completely broke. Not Hitler's suicide, for which she had been preparing. Not the burning in the garden. The deaths of the 6 children made her understand, fully and without any remaining psychological distance, what the regime she had served had actually been. Joseph and Magda Goebbels died by suicide in the Chancellery garden later that evening. General Hans Krebs, who had conducted the hopeless ceasefire negotiation with Chukov earlier that morning, carrying a proposal for a temporary ceasefire to allow the Donetsk government to organize itself, receiving back Stalin's unconditional demand, and returning to the bunker with a rejection, shot himself. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's personal army adjutant, shot himself alongside. The bunker was now largely empty of the people who had defined it. German radio broadcast the announcement of Hitler's death that evening, not as a suicide, but as a death in battle at the head of his troops. A heroic fiction imposed even on the announcement of the end. Shortly before midnight on May 1st, the surviving occupants of the Führer bunker and several hundred soldiers began a breakout through Berlin's ruins toward the north and west. The groups came apart almost immediately upon leaving the chancellery. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, the most powerful bureaucratic figure in the Nazi administration, a man who had spent years dismantling rivals and signed documents authorizing the murder of millions across occupied Europe, left in a group that included Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler Youth leader Artur Axmann, and Hitler's personal pilot Hans Bauer. The group attempted to cross the Weidendammer Bridge over the Spree River using a Tiger tank as mobile cover. Soviet fire destroyed the tank. Survivors pressed on foot through U-Bahn tunnels toward the Lurder railway station. Axmann, separated from Bormann and Stumpfegger in the chaos, later testified that he encountered both men lying dead near the station, apparently having taken cyanide when escape became obviously impossible. Bormann's death was disputed for over 2 decades. Several senior Nazis had escaped to South America through networks using Spanish and Italian routes, and the possibility that the most powerful man in the party's internal administration had managed the same could not be ruled out without physical evidence. Construction workers excavating near Lurder Station in December 1972 found skeletal remains. Forensic analysis in 1973 identified them as Bormann's through dental records and a healed collarbone fracture consistent with a known injury in his medical history. Final confirmation came on May 4, 1998, when researchers at the Institute of Legal Medicine at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich published their DNA analysis in the International Journal of Legal Medicine. Katja Anslinger, G. Weichhold, W. Kiel, B. Bayer, and Wolfgang Eisenmenger compared mitochondrial DNA from the 1972 remains with DNA from a confirmed living maternal line relative of Bormann. The HV1 and HV2 mitochondrial sequences showed no differences between the remains and the living relative, and that specific sequence did not appear in 1,500 Caucasoid reference sequences used for comparison. Bormann had died near Lurder Station in the early hours of May 2, 1945. His ashes were scattered in the Baltic Sea on August 16, 1999. Others survived the breakout. Trottel Jungde and Gerda Christian dressed as men and eventually escaped the city, briefly detained and then released. Jungde was in her mid-20s, had been in Hitler's personal service since 1942, and spent the rest of her long life. She died in 2002, grappling with the moral weight of what she had been part of. Her memoir, published shortly before her death, remains among the most valuable first-hand accounts of the bunker's final weeks. Artur Axmann evaded capture for months before Allied forces arrested him in December 1945. Tried under denazification proceedings, he received a fine and was released. West Germany was his home until 1996, dying at 83. Rokas Mish, the bunker's telephone operator, was captured by Soviet forces and spent 9 years in prisoner of war camps before repatriation to West Germany in 1954. Decades of interviews about the bunker followed, and by the time of his death in 2013 at 96, Mish was the last person alive who had been present there in its final days. A secretary who spent her life in moral reckoning, a political functionary who received a fine and lived quietly in West Germany, a soldier who gave 9 years to Soviet captivity. The contrasts among the survivors illustrated the entirely uneven distribution of consequence that followed the Third Reich's end. The hierarchy of suffering in the post-war years bore almost no systematic relationship to the hierarchy of guilt in the years before. May 2, 1945. Early morning, just after dawn. Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, walked out of his command post and made his way towards Soviet lines carrying a surrender order he intended to broadcast to whatever remained of Berlin's garrison. He surrendered to Vasily Chukov, the 8th Guards Army commander who had held Stalingrad from a command post on the west bank of the Volga in 1942 and 1943, who had refused to give the East Bank up while his city burned around him, and who had then spent 2.5 years fighting westward from the Volga to the Spree. Volga to Spree, Stalingrad to Berlin. Chukov would invoke that trajectory throughout the rest of his life as the defining arc of the war, and on May 2, 1945, it reached its end. Worth noting is what the standard account typically omits: Weidling's walk was not the first surrender attempt. On the morning of May 1, roughly 24 hours earlier, General Hans Krebs had crossed to Soviet lines under a white flag to negotiate directly with Chukov. Krebs was the Army Chief of Staff, a fluent Russian speaker who had once been congratulated by Stalin himself at a Moscow railway platform in 1941, when Krebs served as Germany's military attaché to the Soviet Union. His proposal to Chukov was a temporary ceasefire to allow the Donetsk government, named in Hitler's testament, to organize itself before negotiating formal terms. Chukov passed the proposal to Zhukov. Zhukov passed it to Moscow. Stalin's answer came back within hours: unconditional surrender. Nothing less, no ceasefire, no recognition of the new government, no partial terms. Krebs returned to the bunker with the rejection and shot himself that evening. Weidling's surrender order went out by radio and loudspeaker on the morning of May 2. It deserves reading carefully, because it captures with precision what the defense of Berlin had actually been. On the 30th of April, Weidling announced, the Führer committed suicide, and in doing so abandoned those who had sworn loyalty to him. According to the Führer's order, you German soldiers would have had to go on fighting for Berlin, despite the fact that our ammunition has run out and despite the general situation which makes our further resistance meaningless. I order the immediate cessation of resistance. Every hour you keep on fighting prolongs the suffering of the civilians in Berlin and of our wounded. Every hour you keep on fighting prolongs the suffering of the civilians and of the wounded. Weidling had been trying to end this for the better part of a week. He had raised the possibility of a fighting breakout westward while the corridor to Wenck's army remained open, and Hitler had dismissed it. What is the point? The city could not be held, and he had known that from the moment he took command, and every day spent defending it had consumed military lives and civilian lives for no achievable military purpose. The man whose orders had made the defense mandatory was already dead in the garden above the bunker, body partially burned, when Weidling signed the surrender on May 2. Approximately 134,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity that day and in the days following. Soviet captivity in 1945 was not equivalent to Western Allied captivity. Many of those 134,000 would not return to Germany for years, and some did not return at all. The death rate in Soviet prisoner of war camps ran substantially higher than in American or British captivity, reflecting the Soviet Union's own catastrophic losses, the infrastructure destruction of 1945, and the specific dynamics of the early occupation period. Weidling himself was tried by the Soviets and sentenced. He died in captivity in 1955, 10 years after the 8 days he spent commanding the city. The formal surrender was a military event, one general to another, an order signed, a broadcast made, a garrison laying down its arms. But it was also the moment when the war's most extensively documented and most systematically suppressed atrocity became impossible for those in Berlin to pretend had not happened. The mass rape of German women and girls by Soviet forces had been ongoing since the first days of the offensive. The surrender did not end it. There is a figure that most documentaries about the fall of Berlin either omit entirely or mention in a single sentence. Anthony Beaver. Drawing on survivor testimony, hospital records, and demographic data for his 2002 study, estimated that at least 1.4 million German women were raped by Soviet forces in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia as the Red Army advanced westward through 1945. For Berlin specifically, researchers working from contemporary hospital records and the documented surge in abortion requests in the months following the battle estimated at least 100,000 women in the city were raped during and immediately after the battle. Of those, an estimated 10,000 died in the aftermath, from physical violence, from suicide, from the medical consequences of repeated assault in conditions without functioning healthcare. Historian William Hitchcock documented individual survivor accounts of women assaulted 60 or 70 times. 10,000 Berlin women dead in the aftermath of rape is not a fringe estimate. It appears in mainstream historical scholarship. The figure is roughly equivalent to the total British civilian death toll from the entire London Blitz, and it occurred across approximately 6 weeks, in a single city, at the hands of forces that had just won the war against the regime that started that war. This was not marginal or uncontrolled. Marshal Rokossovsky issued military orders attempting to prohibit rape and looting, orders whose existence confirms the command structure knew exactly what was happening, and whose repeated reissuing confirms how little effect they had. Historians have argued over why it happened with such breadth and such apparent impunity, and the debate runs along two main lines. Norman Neymark, in his study The Russians in Germany, points to the specific political culture of the Soviet military in 1945, the propaganda apparatus that had spent 4 years dehumanizing Germans as subhuman invaders, the genuine brutalization of soldiers who had witnessed German atrocities across vast stretches of Soviet territory, the breakdown of discipline in the chaotic final weeks, and the systematic availability of looted alcohol. Beaver specifically documents soldiers drinking industrial chemicals found in German factories after the wine and spirits were gone. The revenge argument, offered in partial mitigation by Russian military commentators, points to the genuine scale of what German forces did in the Soviet Union, the deliberate killing of an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, the burning of hundreds of cities and thousands of villages, the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners at death rates reaching 90% in some camps. Neither argument resolves the moral reality. The crimes against Soviet civilians by German forces were real and were among the most extensive in modern history. The crimes against German civilians by Soviet forces were equally real. Both are true, and using one to explain away the other is a form of historical dishonesty that serves no one. What is documented without contest is the systematic suppression of the history. In the Soviet Union and in East Germany, the rapes were officially non-existent. In West Germany, shame and trauma were managed through private suffering rather than public acknowledgement. The anonymous diary A Woman in Berlin, published in German in 1959, attributed only to anonymous and later identified as journalist Martha Hillers, was among the first extended public accounts of the experience. Reissued in 2003, it became a bestseller on second publication, more than 50 years after the events it describes. When Beaver's Berlin, The Downfall appeared in 2002, General Makhmatkarev publicly denounced it as lies, blasphemy, and slander, and Russian authorities restricted the book's circulation in educational contexts in 2015. The events are documented. The scale is established within the range of scholarly consensus. The suppression continues. Germany signed the unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was finished. What Berlin left behind, beyond the immediate human catastrophe, which was enormous, was a physical and political landscape that would shape European history for the next half-century. The casualty toll across the wider operation, approximately 125,000 German civilians dead across the operation and its immediate aftermath, German military dead in the city battle running from 92,000 to 100,000 men, nearly 480,000 German soldiers claimed by Soviet prisoner counts, and at least 450,000 German military casualties in total, killed, wounded, or captured, by Britannica's synthesis. Soviet casualties, 81,116 dead by the minimum archival count, with total casualties well above 350,000. Above ground, Berlin was devastated in a manner photographs only partially convey. Roughly a third of all Berlin buildings had been destroyed or severely damaged by the combination of 3 years of Allied strategic bombing and the intense urban combat of April and May 1945. The Tiergarten, Berlin's Central Park, the equivalent in scale and civic function of Hyde Park in central London, had been completely stripped of trees, the wood consumed by a fuel-starved population through the winter of 1944 to 1945. Aerial photographs of post-war Berlin show not a damaged city but a gutted one, block after block of roofless shells, rubble-filled streets, with the occasional intact building standing among ruins like a survivor unable to explain why those around them fell. 4 million Berliners faced the winter of 1945 to 1946 with minimal fuel, a severely disrupted food supply, inadequate medical care, and the psychological weight of what had happened in their city and what had been done in their name. Caloric intake for the average Berlin civilian that winter was, by some estimates, below subsistence level. Berlin was partitioned into 4 occupation sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet, under the Yalta Agreements of February 1945. What began as a practical administrative arrangement hardened over the following years into the Cold War's most visible symbol. West Berlin became a Western enclave inside Soviet-occupied East Germany. The Berlin Wall, built in August 1961 to stop the hemorrhage of East Germans fleeing westward, stood for 28 years before coming down on November 9, 1989. German reunification followed in October 1990. Soviet forces stripped the Führerbunker of everything removable in the late 1940s, then attempted demolition. The reinforced concrete resisted. Remaining sections were sealed during East Berlin construction in the 1980s. Today the site is an ordinary car park at the corner of Gertrude Kalmerstrasse and in Den Ministergarten in Berlin-Mitte, surrounded by apartment blocks built in the 1980s. A single bilingual information board, carrying a schematic of the bunker's layout under the title Mythos Undigeschick Sugnis Führerbunker, was installed on June 8, 2006 by the Berliner Unterwelten Association and renewed in November 2021. The understatement is deliberate. German authorities have consistently resisted any commemoration that might create a focal point for neo-Nazi gathering. The Reichstag stood damaged and largely empty for decades at the edge of the wall, until in the summer of 1995, before renovation began, artists Christo and Jean-Claude wrapped the entire building in approximately 100,000 square meters of silvery aluminized fabric secured with roughly 15 kilometers of blue rope. The project, wrapped Reichstag, required a formal Bundestag vote that passed 292 to 223 after a campaign spanning more than 2 decades. 5 million visitors came over its 14 days of display. Christo and Jean-Claude funded the approximately $15 million project entirely themselves, accepting no public money or corporate sponsorship. The renovation that followed, designed by Sir Norman Foster, added a glass cupola approximately 40 meters in diameter with a walk-up double helix ramp inside and a mirrored central cone channeling daylight into the plenary chamber below. The design was explicitly symbolic, public scrutiny flowing as light directly into the space where legislators make decisions. The first parliamentary session in the rebuilt building was held in April 1999. There is an architectural concept that applies to Berlin more precisely than to almost any other city, the palimpsest. In manuscript studies, a palimpsest is a document scraped clean and reused, but on which traces of the earlier writing remain faintly visible beneath the new text. Berlin is the most concentrated urban palimpsest in the modern world. The car park sits 8 meters above the bunker. Parliament meets in the building where the flag was planted and removed and staged. The Holocaust Memorial, 2,711 concrete stelae of varying heights, designed by Peter Eisenman and opened in May 2005, occupies a site within walking distance of the Führerbunker and of the railway stations from which the deportation trains departed. The city has not erased its history. With more rigor than almost any other capital, Berlin has decided to make the layers visible, to leave the traces of the earlier writing legible beneath the present text. What historians have argued about since 1945 is not whether the outcome of the battle for Berlin was predetermined. It was. The question is whether what was done to achieve it was necessary, proportionate, honest, or strategically sound, and the answer to each component is contested. The first and most direct dispute was the Soviet casualty toll at Berlin the unavoidable price of defeating a determined last defense, or was it substantially inflated by command rivalry, political imperatives, and operational decisions that prioritized prestige over lives? David Glantz, the foremost American scholar of Soviet military operations, whose archival work following the Soviet Union's collapse remains the most thorough English-language study of the subject, argues the Berlin offensive was operationally sophisticated and its costs were driven by genuine military necessities. Speed was required to prevent German forces from withdrawing westward to surrender to the Americans. The Silo assault was driven by the need to fix the Ninth Army in place for encirclement. From Glantz's perspective, the Zhukov-Konev rivalry was a manageable factor in what was fundamentally a competently executed operation. Antony Beevor argues more critically. The Silo assault, in his reading, was shaped by Zhukov's vanity and Stalin's manipulation, and a broader encirclement using Konev's forces to bypass the heights entirely would have been less costly and ultimately faster. The over 33,000 Soviet dead in 4 days for a single ridge trace substantially to Zhukov's premature commitment of his tank armies in daylight on April 17, before the infantry had cleared the ground. The searchlight failure was a symptom of the same pattern, a commander under political pressure making spectacular decisions rather than sound ones. A third dimension rarely foreground: what did all those deaths actually achieve? Germany was militarily finished before the Berlin offensive opened on April 16. The Soviet Union held the city in the agreed occupation zone regardless of when the battle ended. The Western Allies had stopped at the Elbe. A deliberate, systematic encirclement taking an additional week or two to complete would have produced the same political result: Soviet control of Berlin, Soviet-occupied Eastern Germany, Soviet influence over the post-war settlement. The question of whether the pace of the assault was militarily necessary, or whether it was driven by Stalin's determination to present the world with a fait accompli before any post-war negotiation could complicate the situation, is one the available evidence supports in only one direction. The second dispute concerns the Eisenhower halt at the Elbe. Bradley's 100,000 casualty estimate was not reckless, it was the kind of calculation competent military planners made in April 1945. And the agreed occupation zones meant any territory captured beyond the Elbe would have to be handed back regardless. The political case against halting, advanced by Churchill at the time and by most Cold War historians in retrospect, holds that failing to reach Berlin ceded symbolic and psychological dominance to Stalin that he exploited systematically for decades in the post-war European settlement. The Cold War that followed was not solely caused by the decision at the Elbe, but the architecture of that Cold War was partly determined there. The third dispute is historiographical and still running: how to simultaneously acknowledge the Soviet Union's genuine, massive, and decisive contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany, measured in approximately 27 million Soviet dead, 4 years of the most intensive land warfare in history, the destruction of the majority of Germany's military power, while also confronting the crimes Soviet forces committed in Germany. Russia's approach has been to treat any critical examination of that conduct as an attack on the memory of the Soviet war dead. Germany's approach has been to acknowledge its own crimes with more consistent rigor than almost any other nation in modern history, while the crimes committed against Germans in 1945 have received considerably less structured public reckoning. The asymmetry does not change the moral arithmetic of a war that Germany started and whose crimes far exceeded those committed against it. But selectively accounted history produces distorted understanding, and distorted understanding produces bad decisions in the present. Return to May 2, 1945, Helmuth Weidling walking out through the rubble of central Berlin to surrender the city. Take the full measure of what that walk represented. 8 days in command. A garrison composed largely of old men, children, and the remnants of broken units. In order to hold a city against 2.5 million Soviet troops using formations that could not, in any rational military assessment, achieve that objective for more than days. Proposals for alternatives, a fighting breakout, a negotiated surrender, each rejected by a commander who was operating on ideology and personal theater rather than military logic. Berlin's districts fell one by one, each one contested at a cost in lives that bought hours rather than days. And then Weidling walked out and signed the paper. The act was not heroic in the conventional military sense, it was administrative, necessary, and in some ways the most morally lucid act performed by anyone in the Berlin command structure in those final 8 days. It accepted reality. It placed the living above the performance of loyalty to the dead. The men and boys who died defending Berlin in those 17 days, the Volkssturm militiamen in civilian clothes carrying weapons they had never trained with, the Hitler Youth at the Pichelsdorf bridges, the French SS volunteers dying for a regime that had occupied their own country, the Wehrmacht soldiers who had somehow survived 4 years of Eastern Front combat only to fall in a rubbled Berlin street in April 1945, did not die because the military situation required their sacrifice. They died because the political command structure above them had severed any remaining connection between the orders it issued and the realities those orders operated in. The Soviet soldiers who died at Seelow Heights, in the streets of Berlin, in the closing encirclements at Helby, numbered at over 81,000 killed by the most conservative verified archival count, died in large part because two marshals were competing for personal glory and because a dictator on their own side cared more about which building his soldiers reached first than about the lives it cost to reach it. The predetermined outcome and the unnecessary suffering were not the same thing. Conflating them does a disservice to the dead on both sides. The Reichstag photograph shows a Soviet soldier raising a flag above a burning city. Taken 2 days after the event it depicts. The wristwatch in the background edited out before publication. The soldier most responsible for putting the flag there written out of the official history. The city below the image already taken. Almost everything about that photograph is constructed. And yet, the image is real because what it depicts did happen, even if not quite in the way it appears, even if not by the people it credits, even if the moment it claims to capture had already passed. That gap between what happened and how it was depicted, between military reality and the political story built around it, between verified casualty figures and suppressed testimonies, between the history that was written and the history that was lived, is what this documentary has been about. The fall of Berlin took 17 days. It consumed 2.5 million Soviet troops, a garrison of improvised soldiers and children, and 4 million civilians who had no meaningful voice in what was being decided above their heads. What it ended was not only a war, it ended a particular kind of catastrophe, the kind produced when political systems lose the capacity to test their beliefs against reality, when commanders pursue prestige at the cost of the soldiers they command, when ideology substitutes for strategy, and when the people holding great power are most afraid not of defeat, but of each other. A marriage in a bunker. 6 children murdered before dawn. A photograph staged for history. A general walking out through rubble carrying a piece of paper telling men to stop dying for a leader who had already decided to leave them. That is what the fall of Berlin actually was. 12 days, and every one of them mattered.